So if you ever hear the word witness, you're probably thinking of one of two things. You're either thinking of a courtroom, or you're thinking of something scary that Lutherans don't do. No? Just a couple chuckles for that? Oh, come on. I thought that one was gold. So the way a witness works, in a courtroom at least, is somebody saw something happen, or they have some knowledge about something that's pertinent, or they basically have something to offer to either the side of the defendant or the prosecution or plaintiff, depending on what kind of witness it is. And they're there to have their testimony be used to help the judge or jury decide the outcome of this trial. But witnesses are also used for a whole lot of things. For example, I imagine most of us have at some point in time seen a marriage license. Now, on a marriage license, there's these 2 extra lines for the witnesses. And now usually those witnesses are the best man or the maid of honor, but there really just need to be 2 people who were there to say, yes, this thing happened, this marriage occurred, and we're making it legal. When I was in high school once, my friend and I happened to be in the church doing something completely different, and we got grabbed by the neck and said, hey, the witnesses didn't show up. You guys are witnesses right now. And we're like, what? The first time I had ever signed a marriage license was witnessing this random person's wedding. It was really rather odd. But the whole idea really is a witness exists to share knowledge of something and to attest to its truthfulness. And we do use this word witness in our faith as well, though again, not so much because we're Lutherans and we're bad at it. But there's a lot of different ways that people use this term to witness to talk about Jesus. And sometimes it brings up all kinds of different images in our minds. You've got the door-to-door salesman, the one who's going to knock on your door and say, have you heard about Jesus today? And hand you a tract. Then there's the used car salesman method. No offense to anyone who sold used cars, but they've got a pitch. And they're going to give you that pitch, and at the end of the pitch, you're going to know Jesus. Then, of course, you've got the others for whom witnessing is basically winning an argument. You just argue with someone about Jesus until they happen to admit you're right, usually just to make you stop arguing. Still others kind of use fear to get someone to come to Jesus. They mention all of the horrible ways they're going to suffer in hell, and if you want to get out, come know this Jesus guy. There are countless others, and I really question the effectiveness of most of those methods. The best way that I know of to witness is to tell stories. It's kind of simple, really, when you think about it. And it's what the people in the Bible did when they were telling folk about God. They just told stories. For example, in our gospel today, when Jesus is telling his disciples what their job is going to be, it says, you're going to tell people that God raised him from the dead, and that you are witnesses of these things. And you're going to tell people this starting at Jerusalem and then going all into the whole world, because you are witnesses. The disciples are going to be the people who share what God did when Jesus rose from the dead. And today's reading from Acts picks up right after that. It's a couple days after Pentecost, and Peter and John are in the temple, and they see a guy who's crippled, and they heal him. And everyone around them was amazed, and Peter stands up and starts to preach, and it's a shorter sermon than even I tend to preach. He just stands up and says, hey, why are you guys surprised at this? Your God and my God have glorified Jesus, who you handed over to Pilate to be killed and who you disowned, choosing instead to free a murderer. You killed him, but God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses of this. And it's by faith in Jesus that this man was healed, so that you will see that in Jesus God has fulfilled everything the prophets said. So follow God that your sins will be forgiven and you will be refreshed by the Lord. It's a pretty good sermon for a paragraph, huh? Peter's preaching isn't based on some kind of argument. It's not based on fear. It's not even that good of a pitch. He's just telling the people what God did. And he's talking to the people of events that they would have remembered, seeing as right now it's barely 2 months in the book of Acts after Jesus' death and resurrection. And we know from the first bit of Luke 24, when Jesus starts walking next to those two guys on the road, they go, oh, hey, we've been talking about this Jesus guy. And Jesus goes, oh, what Jesus guy? Have you been living under a rock? It's the talk of the town. So everyone knows these things that Peter's been talking about. It's nothing new to them. So what does this mean for us? If we're called to be witnesses, and I promise we are called to be witnesses, how should we bear witness? How do we give our testimony as witnesses to what God is doing? I mean, this is our second or third most important job as Christians, depending on how you count. First job is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? Second job is to love your neighbor as yourself, and I kind of consider telling your neighbor about Jesus to be part of that second job, so I call it the second most important job that we have. So what do we share? What are the stories that we can tell about what God is doing? Sometimes we try to think that we have to tell about the big stuff. We have to tell about the death and resurrection of Jesus, all the things that he's done in the Bible, but sometimes the most effective thing for us to share with others about what God is doing is the ordinary things. The small things that God does every day in our lives. The things that don't feel like that big of a deal, but are still so important to our own faith. These are the things that we should be bearing witness to. The stories of God interacting in our lives every single day. I mean, sure, the big things are important too, but there are little things that we can share. Things like healings. Things like stuff just coming together one day. Comfort in the times that we need it. These are all things that don't seem important, but they're things that God is doing. It's things that God does for us. These are the stories that we can tell. And that's what we're called to do. Not just to share the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection, not just to share the good news of forgiveness of sins, but to share the stories of what God does in our lives every day. And to put our little bit into the big story of God working with his people.